It begins as an inconvenience. The lights flicker once, then disappear. The apartment goes quiet in a way modern people almost never hear. No compressor hum, no ventilation, no elevator cables moving through the shaft. Outside, the city is still pretending this is temporary. Phone screens glow. People make jokes. Someone says the utility company will have it back by morning. By the second day, the joke is over. Your refrigerator is no longer a machine. It is an insulated box full of warming perishables. Meat sweats in its packaging. Condensation forms, then thins. Leafy greens collapse into wet paper. Milk turns first in smell, then in texture. In the freezer, what looked solid yesterday has begun to soften at the edges, then pull, then leak. You are not losing food because you failed to shop. You are losing it because your entire kitchen was designed around one assumption, that the grid is permanent. That assumption is historically abnormal. For most of human life, people stored food through winter without compressors, backup batteries, or delivery apps. They did it by understanding something we outsourced to appliances and forgot. Food survives when its environment is controlled, not with power, but with microclimate. Cold without freezing, humidity without condensation, darkness without stagnant air, separation without waste. That is the real subject here. This is not a video about nostalgia, homesteading aesthetics, or pretending the 19th century was comfortable. It is about mechanism. How ordinary families kept roots, apples, cabbages, and bulbs edible for months by using ground temperature, isolation, airflow, and discipline. And more importantly, how you can recreate that logic now with ordinary materials before a modern interruption turns stored calories into sludge. The modern kitchen feels secure because it is efficient. That is not the same thing. Efficiency means food moves quickly. You buy it cold, transport it cold, store it cold, cook it fast, replace it often. The whole system is built on uninterrupted throughput, refrigeration, trucking, warehouse distribution, supermarket restocking, card payments, elevator access, municipal water, waste removal. Each layer depends on another. The kitchen in a city apartment is not an independent survival unit. It is the final shelf of a vast industrial pipeline. That distinction matters the moment the pipeline stops. What most households call food storage is really short delay consumption. A refrigerator extends freshness for days. A freezer extends it for weeks or months, but only as long as a stable flow of electricity keeps heat moving out of the box. Remove that current, and your expensive appliance becomes a countdown timer. The technology is impressive. The resilience is thin. Earlier societies solved a different problem. They did not ask, how do we keep everything uniformly cold? They asked, what conditions does each food actually need to remain usable? That question produced systems far more precise than modern people tend to imagine. Potatoes wanted darkness, cool air, and humidity high enough to prevent shriveling, but not so wet that rot spread. Apples wanted cold and ventilation, but also distance from sensitive crops because they released ripening gases. Squash wanted drier conditions than roots. Onions wanted more dryness still. Cabbages tolerated cold dampness better than many fruits. Preservation was not one environment. It was a map of separate environments. This is the forgotten principle. Preservation is about matching the crop to the microclimate. Your ancestors were not preserving food through rustic intuition alone. They were exploiting thermal mass, soil insulation, moisture barriers, ventilation gaps, straw, ash, cloth, wood, stone, and distance. They use the earth because the earth changes temperature slowly. They use basements because underground air is more stable than room air. They use crates, bins, shelves, and layers because one pile of food behaves differently from another. What survived winter was not merely what was harvested, it was what was sorted correctly. That is why buying more shelf-stable food is only a partial answer. In a real interruption, the more important question is whether you can create a cold zone, a cool dry zone, and a cool humid zone without plugging anything in, because once the grid fails, ownership means very little. Storage logic means everything. Before electric refrigeration, winter survival in much of Europe depended less on abundance than on controlled loss. A farm did not need to keep every crop perfect. It needed to keep enough of the right crops usable long enough to bridge the dead season. That demanded a forensic understanding of what the ground could do, what buildings could do, and what each food could tolerate before texture, flavor, or safety broke down. The capital city, fear. Below the surface, temperature changes much more slowly than air temperature above it. In winter, that meant the earth was often warmer than the outside night air, but colder than the inside of a heated room. That narrow band mattered. It protected roots from hard freezing while keeping them cold enough to slow respiration, sprouting, and microbial activity. In practice, farmers used cellars, earth pits, clamps, crocks, and buried storage chambers to borrow the steadiness of the soil. What made these systems work was not just cold. It was separation and moderation. A root cellar was rarely a random underground room filled with produce. It was a managed environment. Thick walls buffered abrupt temperature swings. Darkness reduced sprouting. Packed earth or stone moderated humidity. Vents were opened or closed to release excess warmth and moisture. Some crops were packed in straw, sand, sawdust, or dry leaves to reduce bruising and isolate rot. Others were hung, shelved, or spread thin, so air could move around them. Damaged items were removed early because one failing vegetable was not an isolated loss. It was a contamination source. This matters because decay is not democratic. It spreads through contact, gas exchange, moisture, and heat. A pile of stored food becomes its own ecosystem. When one item begins breaking down, it can raise humidity, feed mold, attract pests, and accelerate failure in everything touching it. Earlier households understood this at street level, not as chemistry jargon, but as winter arithmetic. One bad crate could erase a month of labor. And that is where modern people often misread the past. They imagine old-fashioned storage as crude, but much of it was more discriminating than the average contemporary kitchen. Food was graded. The best keepers were set aside for long storage. Bruised or split produce was eaten first, fermented, dried, or fed to animals. Long-term storage was reserved for intact specimens with the highest chance of surviving confinement. What those farmers built, in effect, was a pre-electric climate control system using soil, mass, airflow, and sorting discipline. Not perfect comfort, not infinite preservation, but something far more important and a real disruption, time. And time in a failing supply system is often the difference between adaptation and panic. To store food safely without electricity, you need to understand the three variables that decide whether stored food stays alive, goes dormant, ripens, or collapses. Temperature is the first. Lower temperatures, slow respiration, microbial growth, and enzymatic breakdown. But colder is not always better. Many roots and storage crops do well just above freezing. Some produce is damaged by freezing itself. Others, especially dry-stored crops, deteriorate when brought into spaces that are too warm, because warmth accelerates sprouting, softening, and sugar loss. So the goal is not maximum cold. The goal is the correct cold. Humidity is the second. Too little humidity, and roots lose water, shrivel, soften, and become nutritionally intact but practically useless. Too much humidity, and surfaces stay wet long enough for mold and bacterial rot to spread. This is why the same room can preserve one crop and ruin another. Potatoes and carrots generally tolerate or prefer much higher humidity than onions, garlic, or winter squash. Put all of them into one undifferentiated cool place, and one category will pay for the other. Then there is ethylene gas, the third variable, and the one modern households almost never think about. Ethylene is a natural plant hormone released by certain fruits and vegetables as they ripen or age. In confined storage, that gas can trigger sprouting, softening, bitterness, yellowing, or accelerated senescence in nearby produce. In other words, food communicates chemically, and some of that communication is destructive. This is the triangle of decay. The wrong temperature speeds breakdown, the wrong humidity dehydrates or rots, and the wrong neighbors quietly instruct everything around them to age faster. What makes this dangerous is that failure often looks delayed until it looks sudden. For a week, the setup appears acceptable. Then moisture condenses under a crate. A warm spell passes through the basement. A fruit bag is left too close to a potato bin. A few onions soften. One apple bruises and leaks. Then the whole system shifts at once. That is why passive storage is not a trick. It is a management practice. You are not trying to create one safe container for food. You are trying to create several small environments, each with the least wrong combination of cold, moisture, airflow, and separation. Once that clicks, everything else in this video becomes simpler, because the largest storage mistake is usually not lack of equipment, it is false uniformity. A single onion stored beside a potato looks harmless. In practice, it is one of those small domestic errors that quietly destroys a system. Potatoes want cool, dark, humid storage with some airflow. Onions want cool, dark, much drier storage with stronger ventilation. Force them into the same environment and one of them loses. Give the space enough humidity for the potatoes, and the onions absorb moisture, soften, and begin to rot. Try the space enough for the onions, and the potatoes dehydrate, shrivel, and lose quality. Then there is gas exchange. Onions and potatoes both age in storage. Both respond to surrounding conditions, and both become more vulnerable when confined together in poor airflow. The result is not immediate disaster. It is a gradual corruption that reveals itself only after you have trusted the setup. This is where passive storage stops being a theory and becomes construction. The first method is the buried trash can. Not for meat, not for dairy. For hardy storage crops that benefit from cold, dark, buffered conditions. A metal or durable plastic can, placed partly or mostly below frost-moderated ground, uses the earth as insulation. The goal is not deep burial for secrecy. The goal is temperature stability. Inside, food should never sit in a sealed wet mass. You use layers, breathable sacks, baskets, or cardboard dividers. Crops must go in dry, intact, and sorted. The lid needs weather protection and some managed ventilation so condensation does not build into a rot chamber. In effect, you are building a miniature root cellar where the surrounding soil does the heavy work. The second method is the basement corner. This works because not all basement air is equal. One wall may run cooler. One corner may stay darker and more stable. One shelf may be too dry for roots but excellent for garlic or winter squash. Instead of treating the basement as one room, you treat it as zones. A humid root area can be made with bins, damp sand, or breathable covers for carrots, beets, and similar crops. A drier zone, elevated and ventilated, can hold onions, garlic, and squash. Apples, if stored at all, should be isolated because their gas output punishes everything nearby. The blueprint is simple, even if the discipline is not. Cold and humid, roots, cool and dry. Onions, garlic, cooler and ventilated but isolated. Apples and other ethylene producers, cool and relatively dry, squash depending on type. Anything bruised, cut, insect damaged, or overripe, eat first, process first, or remove entirely. The mistake most people make is assuming storage begins when the power goes out. It begins when you decide, in advance, which food belongs in which climate. The lesson here is not that you should romanticize the past. Pre-industrial storage failed often. Harvests spoiled. Cellars flooded. Mold spread. Rodents got in. Families misjudged winter and paid for it. The point is narrower and more useful. They understood that food security was infrastructure, not inventory. That distinction matters now more than most people realize. A modern household can hold hundreds or thousands of dollars in food and still possess almost no true storage resilience. The moment temperature control disappears, supermarket timing fails, or delivery systems stall. Abundance becomes triage. You begin eating what is thawing, discarding what is softening, and discovering too late that the kitchen was built for circulation, not endurance. So the practical response is not panic buying. It is pre-positioning microclimates while materials are cheap, common, and forgettable. Find the coldest stable zone you already have. Test it. Measure it. Learn where humidity gathers and where dryness dominates. Separate your crops. Keep damaged produce out of long storage. Build the buried can before the ground is hard. Prepare the basement corner before it becomes your only option. Practice with small quantities before you trust the system with serious calories. And keep one caveat firmly in view. Passive storage is best for hardy produce and selected staples. It is not a universal substitute for refrigeration, and it is not a license to ignore food safety. You are extending usability, not abolishing decay. The forensic record is clear. Households that survived disruption did not merely own provisions. They built conditions. That is still the choice now. You can keep living as though food security comes from appliances and weekly restocking, or you can build the kind of quiet, boring infrastructure that still works after the socket goes dead.